This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 385, recorded on April 4th, 2016. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today here in New York City, Dickson Despommier.
Hello, Vincent.
Pretty nasty day outside, isn't it?
It's definitely
Cloudy.
harbinger of what should have been happening last winter, but this is almost
Cold,
halfway through
rainy,
spring, and it's
cloudy. And the funny thing was, it was like 80 degrees 2 weeks ago.
well, that's true.
Down at the Morningside campus.
Yeah, all those poor flowers out there are shivering.
They have what's called Low Beach, where everyone sits on the steps of
that's
the
an urban
library.
beach. It's a great place.
In fact, our guest today knows all about that. He's a return guest to TWiV. He is a professor of biological sciences at Columbia University, Stuart Firestein. Welcome back, Stuart.
Thanks, Vincent. Nice to be. I just want to point out that the weather here, I think, is perfect for opening day of baseball, which has now been postponed, by the way.
Oh, today was opening day?
Depends on who's
Today,
baseball.
Today was Yankees opening day.
I watched.
Last night
I'm
was
a
the
Mets fan here.
I'm a fan
how
of
about
both.
that?
Suffered greatly last night.
Yeah, it was a tough game, but
Oh, I didn't know.
the
it was
Yankees
opening
were
day.
supposed to open today here in New York, and they postponed it for
You
snow.
weren't going, were you?
No, I wasn't. So
You were up in Connecticut for the weekend where they got snow.
it did snow, 3-4 inches of snow. It's
crazy.
A few miles from here.
That's just crazy.
2 nights in a row it snowed.
Wow, we got a lot of rain here, and it's really cold. In fact, yesterday, I read your book in front of the fire.
There you go.
I made a fire.
Perfect.
In the
Thank
fireplace.
God
You didn't throw it into the fire.
afterwards.
That's really
right.
good. It's still sitting in front of him.
And
So
that's why, I didn't throw it in the fire. And that's why we're here. You've written another book. The first one we talked about on TWiV back in December of 2012. It was called Ignorance. And I have trouble getting the titles right. Like when I invited him to come on this show, I said, come and talk about ignorance. He said, no, you don't mean ignorance. His new book is called Failure, Why Science is So Successful. I love the cover, all the X's and one little check mark. It's about 10% success, right?
about that. if you're doing really well.
And this is published by Oxford University Press. I highly recommend that you can read it relatively quickly. And he's got a great style. I really like your style. As someone says, you have 3 quotes on the back here, one by John Weiner, or Wiener, I don't know how he says it.
Yeah, that's right.
He teaches J School science writing.
Science journalism,
right?
yes. And it's a Pulitzer Prize winner himself.
Yeah,
for a wonderful book, The Beak of the Finch. You should have him on sometime.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Beak of the Finch? He
yeah,
wrote
yeah.
a book called, nice.
Yeah.
Brilliant
I
book
teach-
on evolution.
Nice.
I teach in his course every
Oh,
year.
do you?
I go
Oh,
down,
so-
and I went not
I
too
just
long
did
ago.
last week, in fact, myself.
Yeah, and I'm going to have him on. That's a great idea. Although maybe he would be good for my evolution podcast, right?
Oh, yes.
That's
yeah,
what this
yeah.
is about.
That's real special.
Anyway, he says here, after ignorance, failure was probably inevitable.
There you go.
He has a deeply intelligent view of the sciences and arts. He delivers wise words page after page, writing with self-deprecating humor in a freewheeling essay style, a sort of professorial stand-up that is all his own. And that's true. It's a really nice style. And you also have quotes from Eric Kandel,
About that, huh?
your revolutionary new book. And then this is really a good one. John Cole, who we all know, who used to be the provost.
Jonathan Cole.
Yeah, Jonathan
I
Cole.
only knew him as
Jonathan.
Dr.
Yeah.
John.
All right. I messed up another name. Listen to this. With failure, biologist Stuart Firestein joins the ranks of Carl Sagan, Stephen Gould, Freeman Dyson, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Brian Greene as great expositors of the wonders of science. That's
It's a little over the top, I have to say, but it was very much
It's a pretty
appreciated.
august.
Listen,
Yes,
I had the privilege of spending a week up in Toronto,
yes.
at a meeting called Idea City,
Yes.
in which your wife was speaking, actually.
That's right.
You were just
I was just carrying the luggage. Yes.
and we had such a great
Well,
time.
we did have a good time.
And we
did have a
talked about all kinds of things, and I really was very taken by, your relationship with your wife, to see how
Thank you.
how parsimonious it was to have 2 scientists. You know, in the same household, there's usually some conflicts that
I know all about that.
And when they compared you to Carl Sagan, he did have a conflicted marriage.
Yes, he certainly.
But you apparently have achieved balance in light of a very difficult.
Well, I hope she's listening to this.
Yeah. And I was taken by both of you because I had such a great time. So I just wanted you to know that.
Well, thanks. It was a good time, actually. It was a very good time. Have you been back?
Not to that.
I haven't been back to that either.
I've been all over the place since then.
Yeah.
So.
This is very important. Yesterday my wife said, tomorrow I have to do this science thing. And I said, do you remember how to do science? And that was not the right thing to say.
She said that to you?
I said it to her.
Oh, you said that to her? Oh, no, that's not the right thing to say. That's the wrong thing to say.
I think, that's what I would say around. I would say that to you.
Yeah, but I'm emeritus professor. I'm out of the lab for 13 years now. Come on.
Yeah.
But I haven't forgotten.
This episode of TWiV is sponsored by the American Society for Microbiology. They want you to know about their Agar Art Contest. This is where you take a Petri dish and you make some art on it using cultures of various sorts. And you take a picture of it and send it in. And the winners will be selected. And you'll be showcased at their meeting in Boston this year, which is called ASM Microbe. It's in June. You'll also get a free ASM book of your choosing. For full contest guidelines and terms and conditions, go to bit.ly/agarart2016. Really cool contest.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Great entry. We did it last year.
Yeah.
And it's really creative stuff that people do.
So they put all of these things online?
They can draw. They're all online.
Yeah.
You can go see all the entries.
Oh, I'll have a good look.
All kinds of neat stuff. That was beautiful.
So they should make the deadline for this 3 E. coli generations.
That's right. Why is this an arbitrary time scale?
Dickson, how long is an E. coli generation?
About 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So,
it's something really cool. A mycoplasma generation is like 19 hours.
Really?
And in this recent Craig Venter paper where they did a synthetic genome, they cut the genome in half. It now doubles in 90 minutes.
No kidding.
Isn't it incredible? By cutting out all the chaff in the genome.
I'll be darned.
So that really slows it down otherwise.
Yeah, but of course, they're growing in a rich culture medium, so they're giving everything.
Yeah.
Still.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
Order of magnitude or so.
It's just incredible. Yeah. I love it. Anyway, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about failure. And I'm sure you get all kinds of neat things that people say. Are you going to have a course on failure, for example?
Well, kind of.
Rate would you give?
Yeah. Well, that's what I say in the ignorance book, and to some extent in this book too, because both of these books came out of a course on ignorance, as you well know, which I asked members of the scientific community.
So that was first, right?
That was first, and I really didn't intend to write a book about it, but an editor from Oxford Press came by one evening. She was taking me out to dinner to try and convince me to do some other book that I wanted nothing to do with, some edited volume. You know how that goes. And she came to the class first and afterwards said, well, you're definitely going to do a book for me, but I want you to do a book on this class. I hadn't really thought about it, but I did. Nice. And it worked out very well. So they said, would you like to do a second book? And I thought, well, what else do I know about failure, Because that actually, I have to say, was always a subtext of the ignorance class. There was always a great deal of discussion, in fact, about failure. So it seemed kind of a natural thing to do. So I don't think you really need a second class. I mean, they go together hand in hand in many ways.
No, that's great. So I think we should start out by defining failure, which is what you do in the first chapter. It's not just about dropping a tube on the floor and losing your experiment, right? It's more than that.
Well, yeah, and it's even more than the kind of what I would call the retrospective good failure. So there's a lot of talk, especially in the self-help literature, I'd say, about failing and how good it can be, the positive side of failure. Failing because you gain perseverance from it, you learn how to stick with things, you sometimes, you need to fail a few times to become successful. Edison famously said about inventing the light bulb, of all things that I failed. I wasn't much I discovered the light bulb, but I failed 10,000 ways before I discovered how to make the light bulb, which is always funny to me because we use this idea of a light bulb going on in your head as, success somehow or another. But I don't really mean those kinds of failure because not that there's anything wrong with those attitudes towards failure, those kind of aphoristic ideas. If you have somebody on the phone who's just failed in love or academics or scholarship or sport or whatever, right? Then or getting your grant renewed, right? So you want to say nice things like, well, there's a silver lining and all that. But I'm thinking more of a kind of a failure that's actually endemic to the process. That's actually good just in its own right, not because of future success. That is, it's not a retrospectively good failure. It's good because it needs to be there. Because if it's not there, you're not doing something right. You're actually not doing important.
And it has to be informative, right?
Well, it should be informative. I mean, it will be informative if you listen carefully enough.
Right.
You know, somebody said nature screams at us all the time, but we're remarkably deaf to it.
Yeah.
So yes, I think failure and ignorance are connected in a deep way, because failure is the best way into the deepest ignorance. I mean, there's the stuff you don't know, and then, as unfortunately Donald Rumsfeld famously said, there's the unknown unknowns.
Right.
You know, the things you don't even know you don't know. And the way you get to that stuff, the really deep ignorance, I think, is by failing. You go, well, how come that didn't work? You know, now I did this experiment because I didn't know something. I thought I'd find it out, but now I didn't find it out. I found out that I don't know something even deeper because I don't even know why this experiment didn't work.
Right.
Now I got to go back and really rethink this.
Now, you use in this early chapter the idea that Newton's theory was sort of a failure, and it was fixed by Einstein many years later, right? But there he never realized that himself, Newton, right?
Right, although Newton himself, this is always difficult because, you know, history is written by the victors, as they say.
That's right.
And we tend to be selective about history. We just write about the stuff that worked. I mean, even today, what do you read in the scientific literature? You read a paper, and it's always about the stuff that worked. We don't publish negative results. I think that's a bad idea, and we could have a long discussion about that, and I hope we will. But so what will future historians of science think about the history of science today? How did science go today? It looks like it's nothing but, you know, one great Nature paper after another, splashing headlines in the newspapers and all that. But we all know that that's hardly the case, that all these things were behind every successful experiment in a figure is a half a dozen or more flops or failures or slightly wrong things, or it was close but missed and all that. And I think Newton must surely have gone through the same thing. I mean, this notion of science being pursued or pushed ahead by genius after genius, I think is actually quite damaging. It's one of the reasons I think why young students aren't attracted to science. They go, well, I'm no genius. How am I going to do that? You know, I mean, what they see is that they struggle, but they don't see that Newton struggled or that Einstein struggled.
Right.
I mean, there's a famous letter from Einstein to, now I don't remember the mathematician's name, but when Einstein was trying to get from special relativity to general relativity, he simply did not have the mathematical skill to do it, and recognized it and called on, oh my God, I can't think of his name. This is terrible. But anyway, called on a mathematician who really essentially pushed him through with it. You know? I mean, he didn't have the math.
Yeah.
It was a struggle.
I like one of your analogies in this chapter, nature's failure. You know, 99% of species are gone. And, you know, the other night when we were at the Strand, I mentioned it without realizing it was in your book.
Yeah.
So those are failures, but
of course,
presumably it's informing nature. You know, that's kind of an abstract idea that nature is being informed.
Well, you know,
right?
you
don't like this failure business?
I don't like that particular example from a personal perspective, only because if the environment hadn't changed, those would still be the same species, but that did change. And what it did is it selected for a random sampling of mutants that were better adapted just by chance. So I don't know if you could call it a failure of the others, but their inheritance allowed the other things to happen.
So I would say I think you're right about that. I mean, they were in their day a success.
Right.
But just like Newton in his day was a success and continues to be successful as far as launching rockets and building bridges and things like that, there's a revision. And in science, to me, revision is a victory, and that's the way it is in evolution as well, you know, so that something can be successful for quite a period of time and then still ultimately become a failure. And that's okay, too. That's part of the process.
So you think extinction is a failure?
Well, I guess kind of almost by definition, isn't it?
No, but you could say it's a finite success.
Yes. So that's what I'm saying.
Which led to more finite success and more. So the thing that doesn't fail ever is life.
Yes. Well, so far it hasn't. I mean, one day it could be gone. That's also always a possibility.
I keep watching those Discovery Channel.
Yes. Well, but I think that's actually, now we're maybe getting a little more deeply philosophical than we want to get, but, I think that's true of science too. One day it could be gone.
Yeah.
It wasn't always here.
That's right.
Yes, exactly.
It isn't everywhere in the world. There are cultures that are perfectly happy without having a scientific establishment, even though they may make use of the gadgets and cures that pop out of our science or something. But you can live, I suppose, perfectly happily in a culture without science. I wouldn't want to.
I can't imagine. I mean, our life today is because of science, right?
So it would seem to me, yes. And
I always say
It
that.
would be hard to understand, and it would be hard to understand the world in a different way to me, or it would be certainly far less interesting. That said, I think we often have an idea that science, like life, is so, it's so readily adaptable. It's so strong. It's resilient in so many ways. It'll always be here. Don't worry about cutting the funding by half. It'll be here. But I think that's not true. That's not true. It's something to protect. Right. It's quite fragile.
It needs nurturing.
The sad thing is, we only have a small window, us, because we only live so many years, right? And we have no idea what's going forward. Yep. And we may die happy scientists, and in 50 years it may be gone, which would be really sad, but we're not here to see it. The whole idea that you call it a mutation, that implies something wrong. A failure. Mutation,
that's a kind of
right?
a failure. It's a failure to replicate the DNA perfectly.
That's right.
And evolution depends on that
level. If it was perfect,
some level of nothing would ever happen.
Yeah, no evolution.
Billion years ago.
No
Precisely.
evolution.
Boom, gone.
No, we can make E. coli make less errors, and they don't do well.
Yeah,
that's been shown quite clearly.
So the ones that did that are not here anymore.
No, they're not here.
So those are ones that made little bitty
right. So you want
transmutations.
You want an imperfect.
I don't want to call them mistakes.
You want an imperfect process, because a perfect process is, number one, not very interesting and is likely to take you down some cul-de-sac or rabbit hole that you'll never escape from.
So that brings me to another analogy. You made the analogy with baseball, where the best hitters only hit a third of the time, and everyone's happy with that, right?
Exactly.
At least. So would baseball be dull if everyone got a hit every time?
Don't you think?
I don't know. I have no idea.
I think it would. I think this is, oddly enough, I've been back and forth about the sports metaphor for this, which I think you can't take too far, perhaps, but is useful because I think it means something to some people. And I'm a baseball fan, so I couldn't help including it. But I think it's largely true of kind of any sport. There's, we do this funny thing in sport. We say, well, here, all you have to do is get this ball into this huge, big 18-foot wide net. Oh, except you can't use your hands. So we purposely make it so that you're likely to fail.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that most of the time, the big complaint about, European football or soccer, what we call soccer, is there's too low scoring. Everybody fails.
Yeah, you're right.
But of course, one of the interesting things about a game with a high failure rate is that almost anybody could win, even two very unevenly matched teams. One team could get a lucky goal and win the game, right?
But there is a game, in my view anyway, where there's a lot of success, and that's basketball. So it seems they go up and down the court and just score. At least professional basketballers do, right? Maybe less in college. I don't really watch any of this.
Tonight you might see a different story.
Tonight. Well,
I don't find that very interesting.
So I'm not a particular basketball fan for that same reason. Bart Giamatti, the one-time commissioner of baseball and Yale historian and all that, once said about basketball, he said, well, the trouble with basketball is it's thumpity, thumpity, thump, swish, thumpity, thumpity, thump, swish. Now, he may have been a little harder. He was the commissioner of baseball, after all. But I'll tell you very briefly a very interesting story, I think, and a very instructive story about basketball, which has a lot to do with failure and a lot to do, I think, with evolution, by the way, and science and succeeding. It has a lot to do with everything. So several years ago, I came into my office one morning, and it was a relatively early morning phone call. I picked it up, and it was the then coach of the New Jersey Nets, who have since become the Brooklyn Nets, I guess. And they weren't doing well, I think. I wasn't really following them.
Again?
Yeah. So one of their regular seasons of not doing well. Yeah. But anyway, this coach said, listen, I read an article in the paper that said that there had been some research that showed that if you put certain odors in the air, it motivated people. And this is sort of true. If you put some peppermint in the air around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, people sort of perk up a little bit and they get motivated to work.
Okay.
It's sort of one of these unconscious, goofy things that, goes on. So he said, so I got your name off the internet or whatever as being a local expert in olfaction. I'm wondering if you can recommend some odors that I could put in my locker room to motivate my players. My first thought is, I can only imagine what that locker room smells like, right? But I said to him, well, I think the effect is fairly minimal, and you have professional basketball players. I don't think you're going to motivate them with odors. And he said, and this is the interesting part finally, he said, well, let me tell you, we play 80 games a year. Of those 80 games a year, I win or lose 15 of them by 3 points or fewer. And that's true in basketball. As you know, they're either a blowout or they're down to the last basket. So he said 15 games a year, I win or lose by 3 points. If I win those 15 games, I go to the playoffs. If I lose them, I go home. And I'm thinking, well, 80 games, they probably score an average of 100 points a game or something close to it. So that's 8,000 points a game, 8,000 points a year. And the whole thing amounts to 45 points. That's the difference between playoffs and going home. So actually, it is a lot about failure in a way at the very edge,
So I would have told him to just keep practicing shooting foul shots because that's where you lose the games anyway.
Often, that's exactly.
We had a medical student here that played for Kentucky's winning team for the NCAA finals, and he went into the pros. He played for 5 different teams. So I had the rare opportunity of sitting with him and teaching him about parasites while I could pump him with, and what was it like to play against such and such and so-and-so. And the fact is that I said, why do all these big, giant people like Shaq O'Neal, why doesn't he score from the foul line? He slam dunks the basketball, right? An easy shot because there's a zero distance between him and the basket. But when he gets to the foul line, they foul him on purpose so that he'll miss because he always does. Just practice your foul shooting, and that's the essence of the game. So how do you translate the foul shooting into an odor?
I'm going to go back to the lab and work on that.
When you miss, you stink.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, I guess. That's what we say about athletes who are no good, they stink.
But, the people like Pete Rose, who used to hit the ball all the time, he almost never struck out. He didn't get, he got a lot of hits too. When you find someone like that or Ted Williams, those are very rare people.
Yes.
Right? They didn't strike out a lot. They just hit the ball. Sometimes they got a hit, sometimes they didn't, but they never struck out. So it would be boring, I think, if no one struck out.
Yeah, I agree. But let's say in science then, if every experiment worked, that wouldn't be boring, would it?
Well, I think it would, and it might not be boring.
It'd be unbelievable.
But I think it would suggest that you really weren't doing very critical experiments. If you keep hitting the bullseye, the target is clearly just too close. And so I often say this about funding. As you well know, the NSF and the NIH both have these chunks of funds for what they call high risk, high impact or transformative research or something like that. So last year, this is research that's very likely to fail, but would have great impact if it worked. Right. So last year, the NIH budget, 1.5% of it was devoted to high risk, high impact. But then I'm thinking, so what's the other 98.5%? Is it just incremental crap that no one really cares about?
Really?
Don't they have that backwards? Shouldn't all of scientific research be high risk, high impact?
Of course, that's crazy. That's just crazy. That just drives me crazy.
That's right.
No, I there's a good quote by Einstein, which you probably know. He has no tolerance for scientists who take a board, find the thinnest part, and drive a lot of nails through it.
Oh, that's great. I don't know that quote, but yes.
I think that's fabulous, and that's right. You gotta, but unfortunately, when money's tight, you find the thinnest part because if you don't, you get cut out.
Yes.
And that's really unfortunate.
Well, so as you know, there's a chapter in the book called Funding Failure. And originally it was 2 chapters, but it was such a rant that I thought I better cut it down to 1 chapter. But it's a serious problem because when the funding gets pinched, then what gets cut out is the failure. And the failure is the most creative, the most intuitive, inspirational sort of part of science, the most adventurous part.
Yeah, I have some notes on that. We're gonna get to that.
All right.
So the next chapter is called Fail Better. And this is great. I love this part. In science, success can lead only to more failure.
Well,
can you explain that?
Isn't that right? Isn't that where it should lead? Just the way success should lead to more ignorance. The purpose of a scientific experiment is, yes, to learn something, to gain a bit of knowledge, to gain some data about this, that, or the other thing. But really, what you want it to do is to get you to a better, more sophisticated question. You want to improve the quality of your ignorance in the end. That's what we try to do. And the facts are nice, but once you got them written down and published, do we sit around and talk about them anymore? No, we talk about, well, now where can we go? Now what do we have to do? Now what question does this open up?
Right.
And so I think the same thing is true with a success. The first thing you want to see about a success is, well, where is this likely to fail? We'd have to test this some more. There's a fabulous quote by Isaac Asimov, I think, who says that what a scientist really wants to see upon seeing some new data that just came out of the lab is not eureka, but, oh, that's weird.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because that says there's more to do, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
One of my favorite non-science quotes about all of this, which I know you're gonna know this quote because it's from a famous movie called The Producers. Zero Mostel is sitting there after his play, which he expected to flop, succeeded. And he ticks off a bunch of reasons why he expected this thing to flop. He says, I picked the wrong play. I picked the wrong night. I picked the wrong audience. I picked the wrong author. Where did I go right? So I actually used that line in a review of a grant who had great results, but their experimental descriptions were horrible.
Yeah.
They couldn't possibly have gotten those results from those experiments, and yet they had the right answers. So where did they go right? And that's the whole idea. You have to know when you've gone right.
Yes, yeah.
So that's the trick of knowing, not necessarily failing, but I haven't succeeded yet.
Yes. Well, I mean, none of us should ever feel that we've succeeded yet. So, you know, I mean,
we don't have a problem with that, right?
No. Well, in science,
Never had a problem with that.
there's this curious kind of there's this curious kind of double meaning of the word conclusion, right? I mean, at the end of a paper, we talk about the conclusions we've reached, but we don't really want to reach a conclusion.
No, not at all.
I mean, nobody wants to come to an end.
No.
Right.
So what do you do about observational sciences like astrophysics or ecology, where you're just observing something, but you're not affecting it? You are observing as closely as you can without disturbing the system.
It's interesting because, I mean, I'm not a philosopher of science, but I played one in a TV show. But I've talked to many of them. So somehow or another, you get expertise that way. But I do think that that failure really entered science in a big way. Really became crucial to failure when science became experimental.
Yeah.
Which I would say is more or less. I mean, I think historians of science more or less say that's around Galileo. So there were earlier versions of science. There was Greek science and Babylonian science and Arab science and all the rest of that. But they tended not to be experimental. They tended to be axiomatic kinds of science or observational science.
That's right.
And they were explanatory, but not experimental. They were observational. So failure really comes in, and I think is one of the things you can use to demarcate real science from, if you will, pseudoscience, another topic we could talk about for hours. But by failure and therefore by experiment. So, but now we still do have observational, I mean, astrocosmology, if you want, although there's some experimental work you could do there here on the planet with colliders and things like that.
All that stuff is a great example, right?
And but there, I think that the failure end of it comes in with modeling, with the ability to begin modeling these systems and looking for explanations and looking for, quote, natural experiments.
So do we have a problem then with climate change, rapid climate change, based on observational sciences, to try to convince those people who are not convincible unless a more rigorous scientific approach were used? And how can you do an experiment except we're doing it by putting CO2 in the atmosphere? I mean, how do you get those other people on board to say that this is good enough science to make a 95% prediction that what we're doing is wrong? Because that changes the whole thing, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But so I'm not sure the problem, to me, I mean, this is purely personal opinion, I'm not sure the problem is with the science or even making people believe the science. I mean, there's just a political side to this.
Yeah, sure.
And there's an opinion issue here and things like that. I mean, listen, I'm not positive what we should do about climate change in the sense of what's the correct political, economic steps to take. I don't know whether you say, well, we have to stop the climate from raising 2 or 3 degrees, even though certainly a number of people are going to suffer and probably a lot of poor people are going to suffer as the result of the draconian measures we'll need to take. Or should we just let it go a couple of degrees up and deal with the consequences, and because it'll be a lot easier for a lot of people? And I don't know the answer. I mean, I have my own personal answer to that. But to me, that's a political, social, economic decision that we all have to confront and make. But not doing it with the facts in hand, I agree, is stupid. So what troubles me is the willingness of so many people to use the science, to claim that the science is unsettled and therefore unreliable. And I think that's one of the things that scientists need to work on in the way of communicating science, and that is that unsettled science is not unsound science, is not unreliable science. All science is, at some level, unsettled and ought to be unsettled. But that doesn't make it unsound. It doesn't make what's there unsound, you know. That's a hard thing, I guess, to get across. I mean, the use of the word uncertainty is maybe the most difficult one, right? Because uncertainty in the common language means, well, damn, I don't know. I mean, but that's not what it means to scientists. I mean, we work with uncertainty. We understand uncertainty is a something you can quantify.
That's right.
You can work with it. It's a factor, and there's more or less of it. There's different kinds of uncertainty. But if you just say the word uncertainty, we mean something different by what it's going to be taken as from the public.
Yeah. I mean, I'm reminded of the issues surrounding smoking as a cause of cancer, and it took a long time for the statistics to catch up with the opinions. But nonetheless, it did. And it's still, and remember what the cigarette companies used to say. You may be right. We need a lot more research. We're going to put a lot more money into this next year. And they did. They actually supported laboratories to look into an issue that they already knew was fact.
Yeah, so this was a bit more nefarious, I have to say, of course. And this was an attempt to use, quote, ignorance in the worst possible kind of way, where, we just don't know enough, let's do more experiments. And indeed, it is absolutely true that almost the vast majority of the research that showed the health hazards of smoking was actually supported by the cigarette industry. This is, to the tune of a couple of $100 million a year. They put a lot of money into research.
Sure
of course, in the meantime, they were selling $20 billion worth of cigarettes a year. So the $200 million was a pittance.
Yeah.
This was their advertising budget as far as they were concerned, or less than. It was part of their advertising budget. This is all very well documented by a Stanford historian named Robert Proctor.
Oh, nice.
And there's a woman named Naomi Oreskes, who's a Harvard historian of science now, who's doing virtually the same work for the climate change issue, where she shows that, some of this, a great deal of this, this propagation of the idea that the science is not settled, it's uncertain, we don't know enough to act, and all the rest of that is entirely a PR. She has a book called Merchants of Doubt, in which she unmasks this, really. And
Merchants of Doubt. Very good.
Yeah.
In this chapter, you also make the suggestion that any grant proposal should have over half failure built into it. But of course, if we did that, we'd be out of jobs. So how can we do that? It happens anyway. So I will.
Yes.
Before you answer that, my take, I always tell students, your failure rate's going to be about 90% on experiments. And I said, that's science, and that's the way it is. And many of them are surprised. So in fact, any grant you write is going to be 90% failing. But the way you write it is always in terms of success, right?
Yes.
And we need to change that, don't we?
Well, I think we should, yes. I mean, it won't be an easy thing to change because it requires changes sort of deep down. I mean, unfortunately, we're the very people that propagate this system. I mean, we have a peer review system that sort of demands that, how often have you heard a comment or a critique or gotten the critique that this grant is too ambitious? I can't understand that one, really. What do you want? You want me to be lazy, or I'll be lazy? You want lazy people? Tell me that. I'll do
I think that means they didn't feel like reading it all.
Yes, that's
or this is a fishing expedition,
or that's even.
But I'm a very good fisherman.
Yes.
They wouldn't listen.
Yeah, no. If you know what waters to fish in, or
exactly right,
you can get a great deal done that way. That's true.
You bet.
So, of course, this is a serious problem, but and it comes, I guess, from notions of accountability. You want to be able to go back later on and say, "Oh, well, we succeeded here, and we succeeded there," and all the rest of that, But that's not really what's important. It maybe has to do with how long a grant period is. Is 5 years any longer the right? I mean, who came up with the fact that the typical grant should be a 5-year grant and then renewable? Why 5 years? I mean, that was done at a time. So, for example, I mean, I have colleagues. Well, you, of course, probably do this too. Well, I don't know whether you work in mouse genetics very often. Probably not.
A little bit,
You do a little bit. But I know colleagues whose entire research program is based on mouse genetics. Well, 5 years is just simply not enough time.
Sure.
I mean, mice can only reproduce so fast and grow up so fast and have another generation. And that's an experiment can take 2 years.
Yeah. No, that's true. And, in our grant applications now, in every section, we have to have a little part, what could go wrong. And it's always amusing to read it, because most people don't really say, "Oh, we know how to do this." Most of them say, "We can do all of this. It's no problem."
Right. Or they find that one or two things that they can claim could go wrong that they have an easy fix for.
Yes.
Right. Or it won't matter. Yes.
I think it would. Go ahead. No, please.
So, the problem, of course, with that whole structure of writing a grant is that it turns them effectively into sales pitches.
That's right.
So they're no longer really grants. They're a sales pitch.
They are. Exactly.
And that's not the best way.
No, it really isn't.
To do this.
It would be very amusing, I think now, only because in retrospect you can see what happened, to go back to the original grants that started to work with interleukins and to see the predictions that they made based on what they knew and never could think about what they didn't know.
Yes.
And we're up to how many interleukins now? I mean, over 40 interleukins, I think, and maybe even more than that. And here they were basing their entire proposal on what they thought they knew about the interleukins. And of course, they only knew about a quarter of what was really there.
Yep.
And by failing, and of course, then they didn't get renewed, somebody else did.
Yes.
They took it to the next step. It could have been done much faster if they had all said, we don't know what's going on here. Let's all pull our results together and see what's going on. So,
I think that what you said, about it's a sales pitch. That's why it's very hard for a new person to get one, because they don't know how to pitch it yet.
That's right.
It takes you some time to learn those. And
oh, by the way, isn't it true that the best pitchers never try to hit the strike zone? They're just a little bit outside all the way around it, right?
Yes.
And they frustrate the hitter into swinging at a bad pitch.
If we want to go, yes, absolutely.
Damn, why don't we use that for the study section?
No, that's a good point. And indeed, the wilder a pitcher is, sometimes the more effective they are. I mean, you have some guy who comes in throwing 98-mile-an-hour fastballs, and you're not sure whether he's going to hit you in the head with it because he has no idea where it's really going.
Do you remember Ryan Duran?
Right?
Ryan Duran for the Yankees?
Yeah.
You know what he used to do in the batting practice? He used to throw it up into the stands on purpose.
And he had very big, thick
thick glasses. And the rest of that other team just shuddered.
Terrifying, right? Terrifying.
Yeah, because it's a blood sport at some point.
Yes.
A lot of this, you're also in this chapter, talk about how most scientists are working on details, right? And you find something, as we talked about before, and then you just keep at it and at it and at it because you don't want to fail, because you need to have papers for your next grant. I don't see that. We can't change that because we're in this situation where you have to have papers, and that's how you get your next grant, right?
Yeah. So without disparaging too much, the sort of daily incremental advances that science ought to have, and that we do, and they are valuable. I mean, you do want to continue adding to the corpus of science, and occasionally incremental steps is all you have available to you. So you take those, and you do the, you do the experiment that may seem obvious, but that nonetheless needs to be done. The problem is that we're now overweighting it completely with that. I mean, as I say, the high risk, high impact is the 1.5%, and everything else is you just have to propose things that you present as a hypothesis, which isn't a hypothesis. Sidney Brenner once said to me, I was in Cambridge for part of the time that I wrote this book on a sabbatical, and Sidney Brenner lives part-time in Cambridge, most of the time in Singapore now. He's from South Africa. Anyway, we were talking, and he was bemoaning the grant thing. He has many funny things to say about grants, but he said, well, in this particular case, the typical NIH grant these days is, the 50% of it is stuff you've already done, and the other 50% is stuff you'll never do.
That's right.
Right.
That's very true.
This is true.
Well, that's true.
But why play this game? Is this the way we want it to be?
So we came up with a saying in our show that says, trust science, don't trust scientists.
Unfortunately, we are on the study sections. Yes. It's us.
Yes. Yeah. So that's what I said before. I mean, the problem is we can complain all we want about this, but we're also maintaining it. And we do the same thing with tenure review panels and promotions and hiring.
Yeah, that's true.
We make these same sorts of judgments. So I think maybe one of the deeper problems that we have to begin confronting with this is we have to come up with better methods of evaluation and of judgment about what we consider good science or potential science, and what we consider critical about somebody, inspirational or intuitive or creative about somebody, and not just base it on these sort of easy measures like
papers,
impact factors, papers, and things like that. But we in some ways again have nobody to blame for it but ourselves, because we're in the mix here. So, but it's a tough circle to break.
Yeah,
it's very
tough.
Is there any examples that you can think of where that has been broken? Like the MRC in England, or some people up in Canada, perhaps, or
no,
I can't think of one. I'd even say, the HHMI, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, prides itself on claiming that what we do is just give money to what we think are good people and let them go off and do things. But that's just not true. I mean, we all know HHMI scientists who every time their 5-year review comes up, they're terrified that they don't have enough Nature and Cell papers.
Right over here
they need to have their Cell Science and Nature papers.
Otherwise, they're not going to get renewed. So who are they kidding?
That's a whole problem in itself. So this chapter ends with, this is wonderful. You'll like this. how science changes with every funeral.
Yes, that's a great quote. And several people it's been attributed to several people, and probably several have said it.
I like it.
Well, that means you become set in your ways.
Yes.
The powerful people run a field, and then when they go, it changes.
And they control the literature.
I think so. I think that's right.
Look, I spent many years, not many, 3 at Rockefeller University as a postdoc. And I knew all
Oh,
those
yeah, that's
people.
really an old boy.
The Journal of Medicine, the American, was controlled by several very important people, and not the least of which was Peyton Rouse. And he lived in fear of someone coming along and disproving his theory that cancer is caused by viruses. So he used to reject all those papers.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
And Charlotte Friend became his best friend.
Yeah, yes. So this is what I call a sort of monistic view of science. And I have to say there's you don't see this among scientists, but among philosophers of science, who I know we pay little or no attention to as working scientists, but I think at our peril, I must say, having spent now a year with them in Cambridge, that's what I did for the sabbatical. I went and joined the Department of the History and Philosophy of Science. I thought, let's see what these guys do. Is it really worth something or not? Yeah. And I truly believe it is worth something. So, in one of the programs that's I don't know if it's popular, but it's beginning to catch on in the philosophy and to some extent the history of science, is a notion of pluralism, which in politics and sociology and history was mostly championed by a philosopher named Isaiah Berlin, I suppose, in the last century, and many others as well. But we don't do this enough in science. We do tend to get very monistic, and that's, I think, what this quote about changing with every funeral is. Right. You really, somebody gets their good idea, they find their one finding, and now they have to defend this. And the whole world has seen through this lens.
You're right.
And other ideas that should be kept going in parallel are not. There's an old Chinese saying, I think it's a aphorism of some sort or another, but it says, one dog barks and 100 dogs bark at that dog, and somebody goes, wow, what's going on? Nothing's going on.
Right.
But how often does that happen in science? Some finding gets published, we all race off in that direction.
Sure, you look at the authorship on a physics paper, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
The authorship is longer than the actual paper itself, whereas everything else is, you have to know the senior author and the principal investigator. There's this ownership of the data, which really isn't true, is it?
No, it shouldn't be, I suppose. It's an interesting thing. That does only happen, it seems to me, in science, and it happens more in biology than almost anywhere else. I mean, we use a phrase in science where we talk about, well, my science is about, we say my science in this funny way. You never hear a lawyer say, well, my law is corporate law, my law is, First Amendment law.
That's right.
But in science, we use this kind of, my science is, neurobiology of this or that, or my science is virus, the polio virus, something. So we do have a kind of an ownership to it that I think seeps into a lot of the way we think about it.
That's true.
Sometimes for the good, but often not.
We shouldn't own it. It's not ours. It's we have our thoughts, but other people pay for us to do it, right?
Yes, and we should be sharing it.
Building,
we should be willing to see it be revised. We shouldn't be protecting it.
Well, this is a big problem in sharing, that people don't want to share because they want to do it first and they don't want to give the competition a leg up. And this is now very clear in Zika, which is a new hot thing. Everyone wants to keep all the reagents.
The Nobel Prize in here somewhere.
No, I'm not going to give you this or that. Yeah. And so we are just some people are sharing everything, which is really nice, but it points out it's human, we're all human and we have fallacies.
Yes, the sociology of science is a worthwhile area to study as well, I have to say.
I remember on this review session that I was on too, the study section, one of the reviewers of this very large and comprehensively written grant, I started on the parasite section. And this guy...
I thought all study sections were parasites.
Parasites.
On the system. This is all true. This is, we can get into that.
Sorry, I couldn't.
That's okay, because that's
I can't
true.
believe there's a parasite study section. I love that.
It's a study section that's a parasite. So they said, this investigator has produced one paper for every $10,000 of funding.
That's ridiculous.
And I never heard it said like that before. And there wasn't a single word said afterwards.
I mean,
that was just given.
You didn't raise your hand and say this is inappropriate?
Well, nobody did.
That's terrible. That's terrible.
Yeah, this was coming from a senior reviewer whose knowledge about this group was very intimate, not connected to it at all, and said, this is such a productive group, they produce one paper for every $10,000 that they spend.
That's absurd. So, I don't like that at all.
That's not failure.
Yes. Yeah, that's
But
not
that's
failing.
not success either.
No, it's just the wrong scale. I mean,
there's
this is the
little bitty-
problem with many of these evaluations.
It was a big
right?
story. That
Yeah.
could have spent $150,000.
Yeah.
Instead,
Yeah.
they divided into 10,000
Sure.
small stories.
Yeah.
Don't bang on the
And
table.
they got
so
the
much.
they got
know you're
the
excited,
grant
but-
because
Yeah, of course, because they had all
it's
these
the number of
papers out, yeah.
papers and it was really too bad.
Yep.
So I love your chapter titles. The next one is Scientific Basis of Failure. And here your thesis is the second law of thermodynamics demands that failure occurs. So tell our listeners what that means.
Well, I mean, the second law of thermodynamics, which, as I say in the book, is a scary sounding thing. I mean, it sounds like one of those Old Testament sort of things that
Second
you just
law.
don't want to mess with. That, my God, second law of thermodynamics. But it's really a relatively it's not a simple idea until you know it somehow or another. I mean, the idea of entropy, which is what second law of thermodynamics is about, which simply says that things are more likely to be disordered
right.
than ordered, which we all know from the state of our desk or the our kids' room or something
minds.
like that. Yes, or almost anything about it. So clearly, it is more likely that things will be in a disordered state than an ordered state. I mean, you can put milk, you can have coffee and milk are separate, and they're nicely ordered, and you put them together, and now they become disordered, and you cannot reverse that process,
Right.
at least not very easily that I can imagine, right? So. And so basically it says that things are likely to become more disordered. They're likely to fail. They're likely to become decrepit, old, just like what you see going on right in front of you, either things or us. I mean, we're not an exception to entropy. We have to eat a lot and use a lot of resources in order to keep up this thing called life. Otherwise, we just turn back into dust, as it were. We become quite disordered, which is another word for illness, I suppose. And then eventually we become dead, which is
And there's
a
nothing,
real
and there's
word for
nothing you can do
disorder.
about it, right?
No, you can just stave it off temporarily
Yeah.
by putting a tremendous amount of energy into the system.
Well, that's the key. You need a lot of energy.
Yes,
right?
but I think the same thing then is true of everything we do, the scientific endeavor too. We should anticipate that most things will fail, that most things will indeed not succeed, that we have to put a lot of energy in to eke out a bit of success here and there, although that success will be quite worthwhile.
Yeah.
Just as I hope most of us think living is
Yeah.
a worthwhile use of
So
resources.
you have some naysayers. You do, Stuart. You have one big naysayer. His name is Ray Kurzweil.
Oh, yeah.
And he takes over 100 pills, different things every day, thinking that this will all allow him to live a longer life. And he believes that eventually we'll figure out what death is all about and we'll solve that problem and then we'll live forever. And I think I've heard him say it, and he said it a lot on television and interviews and stuff. What would this mean ecologically if everything didn't die? I mean, we wouldn't have an ecology, would we?
Yes.
Because it is about recycling.
Well, it is. I mean, listen, I'd like to live a lot longer than I'm currently been
that's
allotted
different.
as
That's
well.
different.
I mean, wouldn't we all somehow or another? And the aging issue, of course, I wouldn't like to live longer just to live longer. I mean, I'd like to live longer. I'd like to go back to when I was 35 and stay 35 for a couple of hundred years. That sounds like a good way to do it.
Not bad.
That's even less likely, of course. What the social implications of aging would be, I don't know. They might not be as bad as we think. I don't really know. I mean, we have effectively, at least in the developed world, more or less doubled the lifespan, the average lifespan. You have far more people living to a far older age in the last 50, 60, 70 years. And it hasn't been as disruptive as one might have predicted. If you said, well, what if everybody lived twice as long over the next 50 years? How disruptive would that be to society? It sounds horrible. Yeah. But actually, we've done it once already and managed to do it okay. So I just don't know what that would be. But even if we did manage to get ourselves to live longer, I'm doubting we're going to share that with the rest of the animal kingdom. Maybe you'd want your dog to live a little longer, too, if you were
We
going to
can
live
clone
longer.
them. Those are
Yeah, so that's all right. But the rest of the world is still going to suffer from entropy, and we will use up that many more resources, right?
Well, any development you make is never distributed to everyone,
No.
right? I mean, we have vaccines that can prevent measles, but not everyone in the world is getting them.
Yeah,
That's right.
And they should. So you talk about living forever, forget it. That's just not going to be
right.
evenly distributed.
No.
And I'll bet there are a lot of people who don't want to live forever, right? Because they would say, "What? I don't have anything to eat, and it's cold. What the hell would I want to live forever?"
Yeah.
So,
And well, then there are people who do want to live forever who can't figure out what to do with a rainy Sunday afternoon.
Exactly.
That could be
I
my
don't-
book.
I think 80 years
you
is
did.
fine.
But there's a whole
Yeah.
society that's busy freezing people away,
Yes,
hoping for the
yes.
cure of whatever killed them so they can come
Yeah.
back to life again.
Look,
that's crazy. Sorry,
in my
it's
view,
easy.
my view is
Yeah,
you get 80 years, just do something good with it.
I agree.
And enjoy yourself. You don't need to live 160 years. And then make room for someone else, because if you didn't die and the birth rate kept up, this would be tragic, right? We wouldn't be able to
presumably
sustain
we'd overrun the place.
it.
Yeah.
We'd overrun it. We'd have to go to another
Which,
planet.
by the way, we've done.
Yeah, we have to some extent. Although, again, in most places where the lifespan has been extended, birth rates do tend to go down, for better or worse.
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
sure that's a good idea,
You're
mind
right,
you.
you're right.
That's right. So this chapter ends with a little bit of variation on the Pasteur quote,
Yeah.
which is "Failure favors the prepared mind."
Huh.
Isn't that nice?
I like it.
I like that very much.
I like it.
Just Pasteur said chance favors it, right?
Yes. Well, so I get off a little bit on
Reluctant.
serendipity there, which I think is an issue that's a bit overplayed. And
Yes, you did go off on serendipity. You don't think it's the way science works, right?
well, not entirely. I mean, so you could confuse to some extent, or there's some overlap, I guess you could say, between the idea of failure and serendipity. And
Yeah.
many scientists will tell you, oh, well, I made that discovery. It was actually an experiment that went wrong, but it turned out to be better than the
Okay.
experiment that went right. Or, I left something out overnight by mistake and something grew in there and it turned out to be more interesting than
Or
the stuff
didn't.
I was
I
working.
remember
or didn't.
Fleming's original observations.
Yeah.
And to be
Yeah,
dug
yeah.
up again during the Second World War to make
Right.
them relevant.
Yes.
So he moved on to something else, right?
So, and if you go through the Nobel website, the Nobel Prize website, every scientist writes some description of how they made the discovery, and fully half of them will tell you, serendipitous, by accident, and all that. And it's not that I don't think that that's not the case. I just think it's overplayed in the sense that I don't think that's the way science happens. I mean, the fact is that only scientists make serendipitous scientific discoveries. Lawyers don't make serendipitous scientific discoveries. So you have to be working hard on something and then recognize when a failure is actually something useful. That's the notion of serendipity, not
Right.
just that, oh, well, I got lucky. Hey, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Something cool happened to me that I didn't expect and I didn't do anything about it or anything like that. I mean, I'm a scientist and I still am a biologist, but I don't make serendipitous discoveries in physics.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a different definition. The one I have is that you work on something for one reason and it turns out to be good for something else. Like, I think CRISPR is a good example,
Yes.
where they were studying it to figure out how this defense worked in bacteria.
Right.
And then you can use it to engineer our genome. No one could have predicted that, right?
Well, I think
And
you-
restriction enzymes and many
Yeah,
other
exactly.
So
discoveries.
absolutely,
Exactly
but
right.
once again, these were people who were working hard
Absolutely,
on questions.
absolutely.
Right? And so often serendipity is used by many people as a sort of a rationale or a support for what we call basic research, or what I rather call fundamental research. I've learned that we often use this word basic research as opposed to applied research.
Right.
But I've learned that it's often misunderstood among the public as being, basic, you mean like the stuff we already know. So why would you fund that?
Right.
Well, it could have that double meaning,
I thought it was
To us, it doesn't mean.
basic and acidic research. That's
Yes,
what
for example, is another way to look at it. So I try and say fundamental research.
Fundamental.
The idea
That's
of
it's
looking
good.
at fundamental things rather than this word basic. But often serendipity is used to rationalize why we should be doing fundamental research. And I think that's true, but in your sense of the word, the way
It's a different separate serendipity. Because when people, just 1 second,
No,
you can go.
of course.
Right now we're in an era of regulation. We had a Silomar, now we have a moratorium on gain of function research. And I think this is crazy because it takes away a lot of serendipity in research.
Yes.
Because you say only you can do this, and who knows who's going to make the discovery. So that's why it kills me. Yes.
There's a group in Missoula called the Biomimicry Institute who are in the business of training people to recognize when they become lucky by observing nature and taking what they've seen in nature and then applying it to a technology problem. And the one I love best is that TED Talk where the guy has a set of gloves based on how geckos can walk on walls.
Oh.
And it's remarkable because their feet don't curl inwards. They actually curl backwards. When you look at the bottom of their feet, it's just the opposite of what your hand is.
Yeah.
And in order to get them off, that it has to be like that, okay? Because they're prying them off the surface.
Right.
And they looked close enough, of course, I'm
Yeah.
sure that they've got these tiny little hairs.
Yes, yeah.
And that Van der Waals forces are the reason why they can walk on the glass. Now, you would never have guessed that, of course, unless you had thought to look. And you observe these things walking, and wait a minute, they're not walking the way we're walking. We would walk this way. They're walking the opposite
way.
And so they saw that once they got that idea, it opened up a whole new. And so this woman, Janine Benyus, has become very. And guess who's taking her courses mostly? Not scientists, architects and designers.
Oh yeah, sure.
Which is fantastic. I think it's an opening of a way of here's how I know I've been lucky, because I've been able to see something in nature and apply it to it. Like Leonardo da Vinci.
Yes, yeah. This is the famous story of Velcro, I think, right? Isn't that how Velcro was? Mm-hmm. This was a fellow who was a naturalist. I think he was either Swedish or Swiss, somewhere up there in any case. And he used to go out in the woods and get all these burrs stuck to his pants.
Exactly right.
And he decided to have a look under a microscope one time. So these birds had these little hooks, and they would get into the thread of his pants.
Yeah, in fact, on their
change stripping forever.
On their website.
Next thing you know, Letterman was doing stupid people tricks with it.
Yes.
On the website of the Biomimicry Institute, they have a picture of Velcro for that reason.
There you go.
Yeah. And we interviewed a lady, an architect, who went there, took the course, and for the episode image, I used Velcro.
Oh, great.
Because I thought that was appropriate.
Nice.
So the next chapter is The Unreasonable Success of Failure, which is all about how good science has been, even though we fail a lot in it, just as a kind of way, I guess, to show that failing a lot can be productive. But the curious thing is that we weren't always this good at science, only like the last 400 years or so. So why were we so bad for so many years? Was it because we were philosophers and religion, and that was all mixed in, and that was misguiding us? I know it's a big question.
Yes, and again, I'm not really a capable historian, or certainly that wide a historian.
You sounded like one.
I know. I can play the game a bit, but when you ask me really detailed questions. So, I mean, for me, I think the difference was, as we said earlier, the sort of the introduction of experimentalism. The changeover from the notion that science is about facts and compilations of facts, and that there are authorities, and for a long time, people, Aristotle was the authority for a long time. Now, Aristotle was a great philosopher in many, many ways, but his pronouncements about many things were just simply dead wrong. And we continue to use some of them today. It's remarkable. I mean, now some 3,000 years later or so, I mean, we still think there are five senses. The five senses was Aristotle's idea. Right. And there are so many more than five senses, even in human beings. I mean, but we still have stuck. I mean, you can read a medical textbook today. We'll say human beings have five senses, and the chapters are split up into the five.
They also say there are seven sterile fluids, and now we know that's not true.
None of them are sterile, so there goes that.
Yes, But these were all pronouncements, and I think they were based on the notion of a sort of axiomatic science. I mean, this comes from, I guess, Euclid and the success of that. I mean, because it was successful for the Greeks.
No experiments. That's basically it.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd have these big people who would say, "This is the way it is. I've been observing," and I love
Galileo. He did experiments.
Well, that's why that was the
look what happened to him. Look what happened.
Well, that too.
He was brave.
No, he was punished.
Fortunately, he was brave and he kept going.
Yeah.
But you tell this wonderful story in this chapter about the discovery of the circulatory system, which evaded people for 1,600 years. It was right in front of their face.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
In fact, it was all over their face sometimes.
But people have to read it just for that, because it's wonderful. I had no idea of this, that people overlooked it. How can you? It's right in us. And
Harvey. That's why the's a Harvey Society.
Yes.
That's right. It's named after him. Right?
But
exactly right.
Yes.
He cracked it.
And even after he wrote this out, I mean, even after he put this out, the idea of a circulatory system and that the blood circulated, it was yet at least decades, if not almost a whole century, before it was widely accepted.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Again, people had to die. There had to be funerals before this new idea could actually take hold. As obvious as it is to us today, it turns out to have been quite a hard-fought battle.
You have this wonderful paragraph where you say, there are two Roman soldiers, one gets shot with an arrow and is bleeding, and the other one sees this steam coming out, and he said, "How can you not think there's some vapor in you that's really life?"
Right, and so that was the pneumatic theory of, for a long time, vitalism and the pneumatic theory of...
We have rare books in our medical school library.
I don't think they're here anymore.
The rare books library downtown, by the way.
Yeah, they moved them all.
And Bob Demarest, who was a very dear friend of mine, and you might have met him also, is fond of illustrating Leonardo da Vinci's original dissections of the human body and showing how wrong he drew the circulation to make the lungs connect up with the heart.
Yep.
But in a way that let vapors go down through the body.
Yes.
It was totally fictitious. He actually made that part up. And
didn't he do any dissections?
He did. Of course he did. But
he got it wrong.
But he knew that he got it wrong. He made up that part.
You have to worry about, you see what you
Nobody's
kind
perfect.
of expect to see in a way.
You're
You have to
yourself
worry
is the
about
easiest person to fool. Right?
Yes, that's right. That's a Richard Feynman
Who
quote.
said Feynman
about-
quote
I
that?
think that's how I know it from. The science is the purpose of science is to not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool.
That's a great.
You know.
I love it.
Yes.
If you only hadn't
great.
smoked.
Yeah.
The next chapter is, well, there's so much more we could talk about there, but I want to get through a couple of other things. The integrity of failure. And this is all about, well, part of it is talking about failure. And this is something I wanted to ask you about. You talk about lab meetings, how you consider a lab meeting as a success if people talk about their failures. But I always had problems. People would come and say, I don't have anything to talk about because they only want positive things.
This is, as
How
you
do you
know,
change
if
this?
you run a laboratory and you train graduate students or postdocs, and it's still the same with them, the hardest thing to do is to get people to talk about what didn't work.
Right.
And yet it's the most interesting thing to have happen at a lab meeting.
For sure.
The worst thing you can have at a lab meeting is somebody gets up and shows you slides, just all the stuff that worked, and everybody goes, oh, that's very nice, and hopefully when are you going to write the paper, when are you going to write that up? But as soon as something didn't work, as soon as you get somebody to come in and say, boy, I've been working on this 2 weeks, and I just cannot get this experiment to work, then everybody's engaged. People doing completely different sorts of experiments or working on different projects, but everybody's now engaged because that's what engages us in science is, well, why isn't it working? What are we not thinking of here? What's the, you could try this, you could try that. And then it becomes really this kind of group effort that works so well in science when it works.
Well, I think people are more comfortable with that in a group setting as opposed to a larger group, a department. They don't want to talk about their failures, but they should. I find it
of course
refreshing. And also new people don't, the first time they're in your lab meeting,
sure,
they want me to talk about what didn't work.
Yeah,
this is hard to get. This is a little bit contrary.
I remember the round tables that Christian TWiV had at Rockefeller. I was part of that group. And it depends on the attitude of the leader as to whether it's okay to talk about failure or not.
Yeah.
And he was
that's
extremely good at allowing people to say whatever they felt like saying. And of course, in many cases, it was an equipment failure, or it was a reagent failure, or it wasn't a failure at all. I did this, and this. I did it right. It just didn't give me the result I expected.
Yeah.
But no one was afraid to speak up in his presence, which was always important. He was not the captain of his airplane that you never question the captain, right? And that's why the airplane goes down.
The Korean airliner.
So we had no qualms at all about saying, I've been working on this for 2 weeks and nothing's happened. And that is to say, I did this, nothing happened. I did this, nothing happened. I did this, nothing happened. And pretty soon, wait a minute, did you try that? Oh, wow. Then you go back and you try it, and that's the one.
I think one of my favorite stories that I've been told by a former postdoctoral fellow in the laboratory of Alan Hodgkin, the famous neurobiologist, Nobel Prize winner and all that. And Hodgkin, this friend of mine recounted, Hodgkin would come in every day and he'd go from sort of setup to setup. These were all physiology setups, so everybody worked a bit individually. And he'd go from, electrophysiology rigged, one after the other. How are things going? Oh, okay, the data and this, and then he'd go on to the next one until he got to somebody who said, I don't know, this damn thing's just not working. I can't get this to work. Right. And then Hodgkin was take a jacket off and, put it down over the chair and sit down and light his pipe because they smoked in those days. And he'd sit and talk. And he said, well, let's work this thing. Let's figure out what's going on here. That was the way to get his attention, was to not have something work.
Nice. Nice.
It worked. Yeah, great. Carry on. We thought it would work. Carry on.
It really is the mentor that sets the tone, because I've been in situations where you're criticized for failing, and if you are weak a little bit, you're going to get. That's the way you're going to be the rest of your life. You're not going to want to talk about it. I've been at lab meetings where the PI says, "Why are you wasting clean thoughts on dirty enzymes?"
Yeah,
which you shouldn't say.
No, that's right. That's right. Well, and I think the more serious outcome of that can be fraud.
Yes,
that you have a lab head who. Demanding success, demanding a result, but not necessarily outright demanding it, although I think that happens sometimes too, but leaving people in the lab with the feeling that they've got to produce this result, they got to get this result that gets the paper into Nature or Science or wherever. And then, you wind up with fraud. You wind up with people going, well, I'll just fudge it a little bit, and it might not be out and out, fraud in the sense of making data up, but it's saying, well, if I get rid of that outlier, then this will really work out well, so I get rid of that point because, we did that experiment on Tuesday, and, Tuesdays are never good days for experiments or whatever rationale you can come up with.
Right.
No, I look at it as let's see what happens, I think science should be an adventure. Shouldn't have any notion.
Definitely is.
Got to be an adventure. You say, okay, this is what happened. All right, well, let's go to the next step.
Yeah, this is for me the danger of a hypothesis. I understand the value of a hypothesis too to science.
Yeah,
but one of the
right.
dangers is, you get some cute idea and now you decide, well, this is really a cute idea, how it should work. Let's make it so. You
Yeah.
know?
That's right. Thank you, Captain Picard.
Yes, exactly.
Well, in fact, the only time we make hypotheses is when we have to write our grants, because they demand that you
demand
have a hypothesis-driven proposal.
One of the most distorted ways you could
Crazy.
think of science there is, in my opinion. Yes.
I mean, I think you should just have a problem and talk about how you're going to attack it.
I hate
and
to
then-
say this, but I think
Right? Yeah.
that originated with an editorial in Science magazine by Harold Varmus.
What did he say?
He said science should be hypothesis-driven, and that's how we should judge it.
So this is, again, an example of a powerful figure who sets the tone, and probably inappropriately, right?
Yeah.
Although it was certainly true before Varmus became head of NIH, so he must have been supporting it perhaps. But I don't really know where the notion that...
Yeah, well, I know I read it there. That's where I saw it first, and that was
Was that when he was head of NIH? Varmus,
or the Cancer Institute, I think.
Or the later?
Yeah.
Later on.
Later.
I think
It's too bad.
Cancer Institute,
It's too
yeah.
bad we listen.
Yeah.
But that happens often in science.
But he's a wonderful scientist, and I have nothing against his
Yeah.
approach to science even. But, you have to have an observation first before you have a hypothesis, right?
One would hope. One would hope. And even then, I'm not sure that, hypothesis is the best way to go about something. I mean, you have a lot of observations first.
At the end of this chapter, you say failure is a test of dedication.
Well, so that's what I mean by the sort of the integrity of failure, that I think you can trust science more if it fails a lot. I mean, that may at first sound contradictory, but if it's succeeding all the time, you ought to be suspicious about it. Something's rigged
sure.
here, something's wrong. And so if the failure rate is appropriately high, then when something does work, I think you can say, okay, that's probably correct. That's probably valuable.
Right. I was in a Twitter discussion Saturday about being afraid of science, being afraid not to succeed, being afraid to fail. And I said, if you're afraid to fail, you shouldn't be in science. Would you agree with that? Would you agree?
Yes, or just about anything, really.
Anything, really.
I would
yeah?
just not go out of the house. I mean,
Just breathe out. Don't breathe in.
I don't think fear is a good way to go about anything,
No,
right?
it's not.
No.
It's definitely
and certainly not a fear of failing. I mean, that's
Yeah.
where, that's where you learn more about something than anywhere else.
Teaching failure. This is a really interesting chapter. It's all about how we teach science, and we're not doing it right because we don't teach kids about failure. We teach them facts.
Yes. So there's just so much that can be said here. So quiet me down after a while, all right? Because I easily get off on a rant this way. Yes, I clearly science is not just a pile of facts. It's not just a big fact book, and yet that's the way we teach it. Would we teach any other subject that way? Would we consider teaching Shakespeare by just, having a book that gave you the plot outlines? I mean, that wouldn't suffice as being taught Shakespeare. And yet somehow or another, that's what we do in science. Isn't that what you would call a textbook in science, a chemistry textbook? I mean, it's just, let's cover as much as we can about everything that's known. But the stories behind it, the narrative, the struggle that was there, none of that gets covered. And that's quite unfortunate, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that seeing that process, I think, engages students, that seeing the potential wrong turn, seeing how we got from a false idea to a truer idea to a better idea, let's say. I think seeing that process is important because then they get to think that they could be part of a similar process.
Sure.
Otherwise, if it's just all presented as a bunch of geniuses who came to these great conclusions, well, and what the average student sees is, well, I'm no genius. I mean, I thought that. I'm no genius, compared to Newton. I am no genius. So why should I be doing science? I just met this researcher, woman named Xiaodong Lin, at Teachers College at Columbia University. I can actually see her office from my office window, and yet we never knew each other. I wrote a book on failure, and she does these very interesting experiments. She's a professor in education. She's very interested in science education, especially in the later years, high school years. And so she's done this. She just published this paper on I think it's called Educational Psychology or Psychology Education, I can't remember. But essentially she took a very short narrative, two different narratives of discovery to these high school science kids. And one was a narrative of achievement. It was about three scientists, Michael Faraday, the physicist, Marie Curie, also a physicist, I guess, and Albert Einstein, physicist. She took those three people because they were very successful, and we read about their work in the textbooks, but they also struggled quite a bit, each in their own way. Faraday came from a very poor background, was not actually well educated, at least in the traditional way, had to work his way up and all the rest of that as an apprentice. Marie Curie, because she was a woman in a time when scientists weren't women.
Right.
And Einstein, because he was Jewish and went through all of the difficult times at that period of time and so forth. And so she gave one narrative of just their achievements, which is what you get in the textbook. These are geniuses, amazing people, and they found all this out. And then the other narrative included all of what they found out, but was also about their struggles, the difficulties that they faced either personally or scientifically, the mistakes they made, Einstein needing to, find a mathematician to help him out, to figure out how to get from special to general relativity, et cetera, et cetera. And she found that the students were far more engaged with the science when they used these sort of struggle narratives, as she calls them, that they did better. Their grades were better in the whole course, that after they had this section of the course, their grades got better in general. They became more interested in science. Their attitudes towards science and scientists were better, more realistic, more positive. And so I think it's clear that we shouldn't be leaving this part of the story out. It's a fascinating, fabulous story.
You think even at the college level we should do that?
Absolutely.
Because, the writers of popular science, David Quammen, for example, says, if you want to write about science, write about the people who do it. And that's how you engage people.
That's right.
Because people are interested in the story behind it. In fact, and now I'm thinking, I teach this virology course mostly about facts. Maybe I should not worry about covering so much and spend just time on how each story developed and tell them a story. Maybe they'll be more engaged.
I think there's a great deal to be said for that. Now, I mean, this is not to disparage facts, or not to disparage the fact that we need to know a certain amount. But after all, that certain amount, those facts are really quite readily available these days.
That's right.
And if you provide the framework within which people can get those facts when they need them or want them, then I think, and I think I think we all, those of us who teach science, and I do the same thing. I teach cell and molecular neurobiology, and I'm faced every year with this vast amount of material that seems to need to be covered, what I call and other people have called the tyranny of coverage. And we feel a great deal of pressure.
The tyranny
to do
of coverage,
this, right?
That's great. I love that.
We feel that we need to get through this. I mean, this is what the students are paying for, and this and that, And the textbooks, of course, are full of it, and so the course follows. But I actually think there's far more time than we think there is, and that we should use that time to fill in the history, the story, the narrative of science. And that these narratives don't have to be heroic narratives. They don't have to be grand arcs of discovery. They can be cul-de-sacs, wrong turns, the story of the circulation. Why was that so mystifying for a long time? Why is it that we couldn't figure out it must have been 30 or so years that in neurobiology there was a raging debate about whether nerve cells talk to each other electrically or chemically. Well, how come that couldn't be figured out? I mean, finally, it was a couple of key experiments that pretty much solved it. But why did it take so long to figure that out? I mean, I think that's really an interesting question.
It's the guy who had the dream and he couldn't remember what it was.
Yes, dreamt up the perfect experiment, woke up in the middle of the night, scribbled down what it was, went back to sleep, woke up the next morning, could neither remember the dream nor read the stuff that he scribbled down. How bad does that make you feel? But it fortunately had the dream again 3 weeks later and went and did the experiment.
Wow.
And it succeeded. By the way, there's an interesting side story to that. I don't know if it's in the book or not. I can't remember I don't think it was in the book. I don't think I knew about it then. But it's interesting in this replication business that we're all hearing about now, the inability of so many experiments to be replicated. Loewy's experiment, which clearly showed that it was a chemical transmission of information between nerve cells rather than a purely electrical one, could not be replicated for 6 years by him or anyone else.
Yeah, it's in there, the frog story, right?
Yes, yeah.
It's in there.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting case of that.
Because the frogs at different times of year.
Different times of year. He did it in the middle of the night because of the dream thing. He did it in a cold room in the middle of the night in the winter. And all the replications were done sort of in spring, summer, and heated rooms during the day, and they don't work as well. Doesn't work the same.
I'm sorry, I have to leave. I have to go downtown to talk to the engineering students right now. So,
all right.
Okay.
Me?
Bye, Dickson.
Nope, that's all right. Always nice to see you again, buddy.
Thank you, Dickson.
Thank you for including me in on
Oh,
this.
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
Pleasure.
Good to have
Pleasure
you.
and a privilege.
We'll miss you.
Great. We'll see you again soon, I hope. Yeah?
I hope so.
Okay.
I think this is a really important idea because in my class, I know that they are weighted down under all the facts. I just want to tell them this wonderful set of facts so you understand viruses, but I realize after doing this for 8 years,
Yes.
they just forget most of it when they go out the door. And all they remember was that I was engaged and they had a good time, so they recommend the course. But I would like to make it even better. Maybe making a little bit in each lecture, just a little humanity would help, right?
Well, I think so. And I mean, you are unofficially at least our best teacher in biology. I mean, your course gets almost invariably the highest evaluations, as do you, even though I should say to your listeners here that Vincent is not formally a member of the biology department and teaches this course just because he likes to teach it.
Yeah.
He doesn't need to teach it. He's not required to teach it. He's not a member of our department. We're thrilled that he does because nobody else would teach it. And but to our shame, he gets the best evaluations every year, which is why, of course, you can see that you're failing at some level. I mean, it's always people who who don't get the best evaluations. Don't understand.
I can see that it's not perfect, absolutely.
But I think yes, I do think you could, and as could I, spend more time on the story behind the facts, on the things that went a bit wrong, and why did they go wrong, and how did we finally see the right.
In fact, today's lecture is my favorite. It's about how we discovered that viruses cause cancer.
Oh,
and I start with Peyton Rouse.
Yeah,
and it's a very interesting story of failures and successes because it took 70 years for people to sort it all out.
Yeah,
it took 50 years for Rouse to get his Nobel Prize.
Yes,
because people couldn't understand what he had done.
Right.
So if I could do that for every lecture, I think cut out some of the facts. Maybe say if you want to learn the rest, you can go here.
Yes.
They'd probably like it.
And people like you and I, if we're worth anything at all, our great value is that we've been around long enough to know a lot of the stories.
It's exactly right.
To even know some of the people. And so we could tell these stories, and it's wrong of us not to, in a way.
Yeah. So the next chapter is the arc of failure, which actually we talked about, the circulatory system, which is in that book. Now, one of the issues you bring up is that there's this issue with big. We've touched on big people in the field establish facts, and then nobody else can crack through because the experts say you're wrong. So I met a young person the other day, Saturday night, who is actually in olfaction, and he said he can't get his paper published because the big shots in the field, the cell editors say, oh, this big shot said you're wrong, so it must be wrong.
Yep.
And this is a big problem.
Yes, it happens all the time. It's this problem of authority. And so
the authority figures don't want to be seen as failing in any way. Right?
That's right. That's right. It's somehow or another, it's a nick in their armor. It's, I guess they amass some set of resources or wealth of some sort or another, or it's just simply pride. I mean, all the kind of hubristic things that we know are wrong, and yet you see it again and again in people.
Maybe he was talking about you since you're.
I don't know. Now I'm worried.
He didn't mention you. No, he mentioned some other very well-known people.
I don't think I'm not well known enough. I'm not enough of an authority figure that way. So it's interesting though, because they're also the other side of that is people will tell you, well, but people don't want to hear about doubt, and they don't want to hear that you don't know. They want to hear certainty. They want to hear science says this. Eat this and you'll be better off. Do this and you'll be better off. Don't do that and it'll be better. And we want to know with certainty. But, with certainty comes you're willing to accede to authority. I mean, that's the only way you can be certain. So my feeling is really if you're desperate for certainty, as people claim they are, and I don't believe they are, but if you're really desperate for certainty, then the place for you is North Korea. Because there's nothing uncertain there.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
And nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks that's a place they want to be.
Nope. So in this chapter, you also mentioned David de Sola Price.
Yes, a hero of mine, I have to say.
And I was reading your book, and I had my iPad next to me, and I immediately went to Amazon and bought 2 of his books.
Oh, good.
And they're out of print, but you can still buy them.
Yeah. You'll enjoy
one of them. I think is Science Since Babylon or something like that, and then the other is more
Little Science, Big Science.
Exactly.
Right.
Although I don't know when I'm going to read them.
Well, they're both
that's the
very
problem.
short, so don't worry.
Perhaps
They're
I
both
can do
relative.
that.
They're both based on lectures, a series of lectures that he gave. I believe. I know Little Science, Big Science is.
Yeah.
I'm actually working to try and get that book reprinted
Oh, that would be nice.
with a new introduction forward and some new material that has been discovered.
It would be nice to have an e-version, so because I have to get paper books, and I hate accumulating more paper that I have now. But one thing that struck me is I've been a scientist for a long time. I really never read about history or philosophy of science. I'm too busy with my own stuff. But then when I read a book of yours, it takes me into that, and I realize there's a whole nother world of people who think about this very deeply.
Yes. So
like David, right?
Yeah. So if there was, in fact, if I write a third book, which I never intended to write one, let alone two, so I don't know if it's a third here or not. But one of the issues that I'd actually like to write about, either in a book or some essays or something, is why scientists should care about the philosophy and history of science. There are these people, Richard Feynman, the physicist, famously said that philosophers of science are to scientists the way ornithologists are to birds.
That's right.
You're welcome to study me, but I could care less.
Yes, I could care less.
Kind of thing.
Right.
Then, of course, Feynman went on to write book after book filled with philosophy of science issues and things like that. So I think he was just trying to get rid of the competition somehow or another. So, because he really did recognize how important philosophy was to science in so many ways. And I would say, to the bench scientist, to when you're working at the bench, when you're working with students, or if you're a graduate student or a postdoc or young scientist still really working experiments on a regular basis, maybe philosophy is not going to change the way you do that.
Right.
I don't think so. But for most scientists, at some point in their career, as they become more and more senior, they spend less and less time at the bench typically, and more of their time involved in the infrastructure of science, which is no less important in the end because we need to support this infrastructure. But that infrastructure includes, as we've said already, reviewing grants, reviewing manuscripts, hiring faculty, tenuring faculty, admitting graduate students, making decisions on curriculum. And I think all of those things should be informed by a sense of the philosophy and history of science.
I agree. I think you're right that when you're young, you just want to do your experiments.
That's fine.
Don't tell me. I don't want to hear any of this. Just tell me I want to publish a paper. But when we get old, we tend to be more introspective and thoughtful, and you want to know how the world views a scientist. And these people who write philosophy of it obviously look at us. They study us.
Yes, very much so. And the way it develops and the way we do it now and the way we did do it.
I'd like to know their views, but also how we're perceived, and should we be different, and and that sort of thing. I also have another book that I've had for a long time but never read, and it's by this fellow Richard Kuhn, or Robert Kuhn. He talked about the paradigm shifts.
Oh, Thomas Kuhn.
Thomas Kuhn,
the structure of scientific revolution.
Right. You've read that, I said.
Yes, quite a while ago, though. I've since reread chunks of it.
Should I read that also?
Yes, it's a very important book for a couple of reasons, I think. One is, so first of all, historians, and he was I think he would call himself a historian of science. Okay. But he uses a great deal of philosophy in the book. And this is a curious thing that I learned recently. Historians of science and philosophers of science don't actually get along very well. So you would think, to us, they're kind of doing the same thing, right? Yeah. But nope, they don't get along very well at all. They have very different ideas about methodology and the way things should be seen and all the rest of that. So they argue quite bitterly, it seems. They have their own journals and all the rest of that. One of the things that Kuhn did with his book was he used, for the first time apparently, or first modern time, he really blended history and philosophy to come up with an important new idea. And so that suddenly made it more sensible for there to be a history and philosophy of science as a field. And there are now half a dozen or so departments of history and philosophy of science. But the more important thing, perhaps, was he came up with this idea of a paradigm shift, which has been both good and bad. I'd say nowadays mostly bad, mostly misunderstood, both by scientists and by the general public. So I don't blame Kuhn entirely. I think he would claim he's been misunderstood. I hope he would anyway. But his notion was simply that science toodles along what he calls normal science. We do experiments, and little by little anomalies, failures, if you will, pop up. Experiments don't work out quite the way they ought to. The orbit of the planets doesn't follow exactly the way Newton's laws predicted, or this or that. So there are little things that pop up, but eventually they become too many to ignore. And it requires us to come up with a new paradigm, a paradigmatic shift in the way we think about it. The classic example being going from Newton to Einstein, that you could no longer simply describe gravity the way Newton did because there were too many cases where it didn't quite work out. And Einstein came along and showed that actually gravity should be looked at in a slightly different way within certain frames. And so there was a paradigm shift. Unfortunately, that's been interpreted often to mean, well, why should I listen to what you have to say now if you're just going to shift paradigms? If you're just going to say, well, all that's bull, and here's the new way to think about it tomorrow. So why should I bother to study it or be interested in it or listen to it? And that, of course, is wrong. You don't shift shifting a paradigm doesn't mean throwing something out. Newton still is correct. It's just we have to redefine the frame in which it's correct. And now we've expanded into a new area where Newton doesn't work, but Einstein does.
Right.
But it didn't prove Newton wrong. You know?
We still use a lot of what he figured out.
One of my favorite examples of this, I have to say, is from a friend of mine, a philosopher of science named Ha-Suk Chang, who's at Cambridge University in the department there. And he uses the GPS device. He tells this wonderful story about a GPS device. He says, because the GPS device, familiar to all of us, actually uses 4 different branches of physics who don't agree on very much between them. So in order to launch the satellite that has the GPS device in it, you use Newtonian physics because that's how you get a satellite up into orbit. But then on that satellite is an atomic clock, which requires quantum physics to keep time. And then because it's in low gravity, there has to be an Einsteinian relativity correction for the time. Otherwise, it would be off by several hundred milliseconds or something like that. And all 3 of these branches of physics are in the service of sending back to us a flat map, a flat Earth version of a map, right? So we're back to the flat Earth, right? It's remarkable.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, it was in the book as well. So in your field, can you identify a paradigm shift? Would the transmitter being a chemical versus electricity? Would that be one?
So I suppose that could be one. Yes. I think we're beginning to. We're sort of in the middle of one now. I think with people thinking about whether or not the wiring of the brain, the connections between cells, will explain how the brain works, or whether there's something else deeper than that, or that as it were, knowing the wiring diagram won't be sufficient. You know, a guy named Yuri Lezebnik, who's a cancer researcher actually, who wrote a wonderful little sort of opinion piece I think it was in Cell several years ago, called "Can a Biologist Fix a Radio?" in which he compared the engineering ability to look at a wiring diagram and reverse engineer it. But you can't always do that in biology.
Right.
It's much more difficult.
No, that's cool. Yeah, I guess knowing that DNA is genetic material, that would be a big paradigm shift.
Yes,
right?
yes. And now knowing that, that there's this sort of epigenetics, that the DNA to RNA to protein, what used to be called, believe it or not, the central dogma.
Right.
Should scientists ever use the word dogma? I can't believe it, but we call it that still.
Were Watson and Crick responsible for that? They wrote a paper saying this is the central
dogma, and everybody just says that, and we teach it. It's in textbooks.
A little hubris. Right?
Yes, but it's clearly not true now. So that was, I think, quite a shift.
Well, that's why reverse transcriptase was called reverse, because they said it goes against
the central, right, the opposite direction.
It's so funny. There's a chapter called The Scientific Method of Failure, where you talk about actually hypothesis-driven research, which we've already touched on. And I learned in this chapter that you did a TED Talk, which I hadn't seen. I have to look at. We'll put a link in the show notes. You talk about science should be farting around. Is that right?
Yes. I think
So did they get you to do that after your first book? Is that right?
I did that after the first book. So it's really more about ignorance. There's not much mention of failure in that TED Talk, but it's more about ignorance. And the claim that I make is that, well, I like to use this. I open ignorance, I think, with this this anonymous old proverb that says it's very difficult to find a black cat in a dark room, especially when there is no cat. I think that's just a perfect description of science.
Yes, it's great.
And so what we do is, we really don't have hypotheses. We kind of, fart around in dark rooms and hope for the best. And somehow that we bump into things now and again, cats or otherwise, and learn stuff.
I just, when I was reading this, and this also has a discussion of the scientific method in capital letters, right?
Yes.
I've never done any of this. I just, I have a virus that I happen to work on because I did a postdoc, and then I have a lab, and I say, well, what's interesting? What can we do? Well, we don't know this, so let's figure that out. And that's the way we just do experiments.
Yes.
What kind of experiment will we need to do? And then when you have to write a grant proposal, then you put that into some formal thing to please them, just to please them, as we've said before.
There's a wonderful article by Medawar. What's Medawar's first name?
Peter
Medawar. Sir Peter Medawar, the British immunologist, who was a great popularizer of science. Mm-hmm. He was sort of the Carl Sagan of England and in biology. And he wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post, I believe, which you can still, I think, now get online, called Is the Scientific Paper a Fraud? And his answer is yes, in the sense that the results are presented not in the order in which they were discovered, but in a narrative order in which they now make some sense. But that the true scientific method never goes the way it's written down, the way the experiments are written down. We find things out, we go backwards, we go forwards, we go backwards again, we revisit. And then, but when you put it in a paper, you put it all in, I always tell my students, if you read the words, if you read at the beginning of a paragraph in a paper somewhere, you read the words, we reason that.
Yeah, that means...
I said, totally ignore that.
I agree with that.
That's bullshit.
So often I say, this means it didn't happen in this order.
That's right. Absolutely.
So you think we should just write them the way they happened?
No, I mean, I think it's okay to put them in some sense. Well, we should recognize, and our students should recognize, that this is, it doesn't go quite so smoothly.
It would be nice to have the story behind it. There should be a little addendum for each paper where you actually tell, we were doing this one day and we found this. That would be a great way to teach the paper, right?
So I have thought on several occasions, and I still believe this is a worthwhile proposal, that it would be interesting to have a sort of a yearly publication which took somehow or another decided on the 10 most interesting papers in science. I don't care. I would put a board of directors together, a board of editors together. They pick 10 interesting papers from that year that were published, in whatever journals, fancy journals or not, and go to the authors and say to them, look, how would you like to write the sort of the director's cut of that paper? The one where you didn't have to slash everything out to fit it in the in the format. How would you like to tell the story of that paper? And we'll assign an author, a writer, to help you out with this. And we could just interview the person, for example, and then let a science writer actually write. The paper would be republished, but now in a lengthier form with the whole story behind it. And I think it'd be fabulous to have that come out once a year, where you could actually read a paper with the people who did the work, their deeper explanation of the story behind it.
Yeah, we try and do that on my podcast. Now and then we'll have whoever's done a paper come on with us, and they will tell us, we were doing this, and this is what happened. And that's kind of...
I think that's great. I mean, this is the way into the process,
There's a nice chapter on failure in the clinic, and... at the very beginning, you say medicine is not science, though it is rooted in it. And I think it's important that everyone, probably people who listen to this podcast, know that.
Yeah.
But, many people think doctors are scientists.
Yes. Yeah.
And I tell them, you don't want a scientist taking care of you.
I was going to say, yes, that's exactly right. The last thing I want is somebody doing an experiment, varying one variable at a time while I'm in there dying, Now,
an interesting aspect of this chapter, which I didn't realize, is that the placebo effect is about 30%.
Yes.
Do we have any idea? So basically, if you give, in a clinical trial, if you give one group a drug and one group a placebo, about 30%
will get better anyway.
Will get better. And that's...
Or show some...
Now, let's say you're giving them an antiviral. They will get just better because they would have anyway, or...
Well, you do have an immune system, and, it will in many cases. I mean, the many viruses, I guess we get, this better than me, that your immune system takes care of.
Yeah, I suppose so. So that's what the number is. If the FDA is going to approve something, it's got to be better than...
Supposedly should be better than 30%.
For anything
really
like
efficacious.
Even a drug for mental illness has to be better than 30%.
30%.
Wow.
Well, I think drugs for mental illness are probably the most placebo...
driven,
yeah.
You give people a drug, placebo, they don't know what it is, and they say, oh, I feel better, right?
It's just
tough.
Either the attention. I mean, there are many people now finally studying the placebo effect. It's been known for a long time, and yet really has never been studied carefully. But to me, I mean, I often joke that I'd rather have the placebo than the drug, because you get all the good effects and none of the side effects.
Yeah, of course. That's what you said in the chapter. Yeah. You also said that maybe clinical trials are the most carefully done science, even though they're not experimental science in a sense, but they're all carefully controlled and monitored things that we don't do.
Right.
Which is really good way to look at it. And probably it should be that way, right?
Yeah.
Because that's going to decide whether it gets into people or not. I realize we're going a long time here, but there are a few more things I wanted to cover. And we'll be done by 3. How's that?
Yep.
20 more minutes, and we can go downtown together. I presume you're going back down to Morningside. Yes. We can take a subway together.
All right.
You got a chapter on negative results, which I think we've talked about a little bit. And I just wanted to tell you a story. Years ago, we had a paper where we had done something and didn't turn out the way we wanted it, but I thought it was informative. And everywhere we tried to publish it, we were told we don't publish negative results.
Yep. I think that's a big problem.
And today, of course,
it's still true, isn't it?
It's still true. Of course, Nature won't publish a negative result. There are other journals that will, but they're valuable because, as you say, they're failures in a way, and that's what drives science forward, right?
No, I mean, as you know, it's a tricky business because a negative result is very valuable because if you want to do some experiment, it might be useful to know that somebody else already tried that experiment and it didn't work. On the other hand, of course, it could be that they tried the experiment and it didn't work because they didn't have the right reagent, they didn't have the right idea, they have crappy experimental technique, who knows what it was. Yeah. And if you did it, it might work. So you don't want to put people off the track necessarily. So it has to be kind of carefully thought about. But I still think it's silly, first of all, since about, as you pointed out, 90% of what people do are failures or come up with a negative result. That means 90% of the work that's being done and paid for is not seeing the light of day. The only place we hear about it as professionals is when we go to a meeting and sit through a bunch of boring presentations and finally get to the bar that evening and sit down and talk to people and say, well, I was thinking of doing this experiment. They go, I tried that. It didn't work. And you say, well, then you can ask, how come? What do you think? Or what could we do different? Or, it should have worked, shouldn't it? And so forth.
On the other hand, you don't want to have a negative result published and then people don't ever try it again because maybe in their lab it would turn out differently.
That's right. Or a negative result from 5 years ago might not be a negative result today with a new technology or a new technique or better.
That's how publishing works. People will see a paper and go, I don't agree with that. I'm going to try something else, and they change it. So it should be the same. If
it was a negative result, yes.
If people really care about something, I mean, we have to realize that a lot of science nobody cares about enough to reproduce or look at, right? But those things that matter, and that's something
they have to stand the test.
They will stand the test of time. Now, this. Go ahead.
Well, I was also going to say that if you had a place for negative results, then it's also true that the more times a particular negative result was posted, because people are still going to do them, and they're going to do them in parallel. People don't know what everybody else is working on, and so if suddenly you see that this negative result is, has been posted by 5 or 6 different labs, now you begin to think, well, probably it is a real legitimate negative result. It's not just somebody's bad technique or something like that. In fact,
you propose a website,
yes,
people could submit this. But
I have tried for a while to do this. I have a new idea about it now. But
okay. I think it's hard to have all negative results in one place. You'd like to have it mixed with the positive results.
It would be a little bit more, it would be a little less depressing place, I guess.
But one of the key points of this chapter is that there is a certain irreproducibility in science, and it shouldn't be viewed as a negative. And as you point out, some people are making a living pointing this out.
Yes.
Right?
This is, I think, one of the great disasters of the current scientific landscape, especially the public relations part of it. This idea that we're in the midst of some replication crisis, as it's always called, that, we're unable to replicate some large percentage of the papers that are out there. And it seems to affect, although it's certainly true in biomedical research, it seems to be most prevalent in psychology and social science and so forth and so on. And what I'd say there is that that's, to me, to be expected. First of all, I think if everything got replicated, then that can't be right somehow. There must have been something that was different or overlooked. So I think the fact that something can't be replicated actually is interesting. It doesn't say to me that what was done prior was wrong. It says that, well, those people did something. They didn't even know there was some variable that they didn't know they didn't control for. Yeah. Because when I try and do it, I don't get the same thing. So there must be something different between what the two of us have done. And now that's really interesting to find out.
I mean, again, if it's important, people will sort it out.
Yes.
But I know there's an example of a mouse experiment done exactly the same in 2 different cities, and they get totally different results. And it turns out that the cologne that the investigator was wearing made a big difference.
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yes. Now we know there was a study on this, and NIH showed that it makes a difference whether you're doing mouse work. It makes a difference whether the experimenter handling the mouse is a man or a woman.
Yeah.
That this can change the results in some sets of experiments.
Of course. And the lighting, too. Most mouse facilities have a cycle, but sometimes it breaks. I know in our facility it broke, and it was light for like a week straight, and people just kept doing their experiment. Who knows? Yeah. But that's the beauty of science, that failure informs you, right? That's
yes, absolutely.
What you would say.
So we should take these replication failures as as an opportunity, not as some sort of a critique of science or something like that. And the other problem is, of course, they're often conflated with fraud, which is not the same thing at all.
Exactly. That's totally different.
That's a completely different thing. Right. So there's nothing to be ashamed of if an experiment you did isn't easily replicated somewhere. It just means we've got to go back and dig a little bit here and find out what the differences were.
That's absolutely right. There are also some nice chapters. The next one, Philosophy of Failure, is all about pseudoscience and real science and trying to distinguish. And I was struck by your point about Steve Jobs. Here you have a smart guy who had early stage pancreatic cancer and did pseudoscience. He had pseudomedicine done and he died.
Yes. I mean, it's hard to understand, right? So I use that example, not to disparage Jobs particularly, but because I think so many people in the public mind have this idea that, the people who believe in pseudoscience, they're all religious nutcases or right-wing crazies or something like that. There are many smart people on all ends of the political spectrum. The whole vaccine thing, as you know.
A lot of the anti-vaxxers are
This is all, headquartered in Marin County, California, which is full of very well-educated, very rich people, So nobody owns this pseudoscience problem.
I know, and that's always puzzling to me. I used to interact with some anti-vaxxers, and they would say, I'm intelligent, I do the literature search, I decide what vaccines to give my kids. I don't know, maybe it's a case of being too smart.
Yes, yeah. Well, yes, it could be. It could be.
You mentioned a book by Donald Brabin on 500 discoveries that came about by curiosity-driven research. That I have to check out because that sounds really good.
Yeah, he's an interesting fellow, and that's what he is a crusader in England about this. The fact that we, in fact, he wrote a editorial that appeared in The Guardian and then a couple of other newspapers, eventually signed on by dozens, maybe 100 scientists or more, many of whom were Nobel laureates and all that. And the title of the article was, "We Need More Mavericks in Science." And it was about this notion that you just, you get smart people and you turn them loose on the playground kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Let their curiosity take them somewhere. And that may sound a little laissez-faire and a little, really, should we trust them and all the rest? That shouldn't there be some control? But there are lots of controls, because after a while, if the fooling around in the playground doesn't turn up anything interesting, you stop doing it and you go on to something else. I mean, we're not just there to play in the
a smart, well-trained scientist who knows how to do their experiments. They'll move on, right?
Yes.
They're not going to bang their head against the wood forever.
No, I don't think. Or maybe a few who will, but
some
not
will.
long.
Yeah, some will, and then they'll get filtered out. I think.
Yes.
One of the other interesting chapters I like is Pharma Failure, the biggest failures in science.
Yes.
Big Pharma. Is that because it's hard to get things that are going to go in people?
I think that's a lot of it. I mean, I think pharma is a somewhat complicated situation these days, because these are, the big pharma companies went from being, I think a mere 10 or 15 years ago, they were considered to be, quote, the best companies in America, not just the best to invest in or the best, but they were the best because they did good.
Right.
They were like the model company. This was the best kind of business to be in. And now we consider them mostly, just this side of being criminal in their activities most of the time.
Yeah, they are vilified, aren't they?
So they certainly are. So that's a bit of a difficulty. But I also think that, of course, there are many problems endemic to just how it's done and how it's regulated. It may be over-regulated in some areas and under-regulated in others. And these, sort of huge randomized trials. And I think for many years, pharma has depended on the idea of a success versus a failure.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what a controlled trial, randomized controlled trials, the gold standard and all that. It either succeeds or it fails at the end of some god-awful number of years. So it can be very depressing, I think, if you're in pharma, that you've gone all the way through to phase 3 and all this expense and all this work, and then the trial fails. And
Yeah,
you go, well, that's
tough.
it. Just dump it and go on, to something else. But now I think they're beginning to recognize that that these are not just, it's not just a black or white yes or no answer, that you actually can get a great deal of data out of a so-called failed trial.
Yeah,
because
sure.
after all, it did work for some people. Why did it work for some people?
Yeah, there are great examples in the vaccine trial world. We've been trying to make HIV vaccines for years, and every one of them has been a failure, but they learned something and they fix it in the next one. It's just a moving target,
Yes,
unfortunately. The dengue vaccine is really interesting. They made one that looked good and it had some failings, so they tried to improve it. Now they have a second generation. So if a problem's important enough, people will push through it. And, if billions of people are at risk for something, you can bet that there will be resources to figure it out.
Yes.
Well, someone told me once who worked in pharma, the best way to rise through the ranks is to cancel all your projects. That way you don't fail.
That's disturbing.
Isn't that terrible?
It's very disturbing, yes.
Because, you could start with 10 different targets.
Right.
And so you got to get rid of 9 of them right away, even though they may all look good.
Yeah.
Because you can't do all of them, and you have less chance of failing. Because unfortunately in pharma, the measure in the end is success by many standards, but the worst one being Wall Street.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, unfortunately. This is
Too
it,
bad.
right?
And one last comment in the coda to the book. I think this is a really interesting theme that we've touched on. It's all about when experts become elites. That is, they become so established that you can't criticize or question anything they say anymore. And that's really bad for science, isn't it?
Yes, it's the way old science, I guess, used to work, and it couldn't be a worse thing to come back around to.
Failure has to be admitted by everyone, not just us, but the big guys, the Nobel Prize winners have to agree that they failed.
Because it is why science is so successful. I mean, it's not a shame. It's not a tragedy. It's not a bad thing. It's not a black mark. It's not you're not very good or anything like that. It really should be embraced because it's such an integral part of the process.
All right, let me ask you 3 questions at the end. First, why does the Discovery Channel run specials on penguins and whatever? That's not real science, and they call it Discovery Science. Why do they do that? Is that the only way to engage people?
Well, I assume that they have some sort of focus group or something like that who knows that this is what
people want.
This is what the audience wants out there. And I guess as long as they weave a couple of shows in here and there, I've often wondered why there isn't really, there's all this bandwidth on the cable that there isn't a real sort of science channel. Why isn't there a show called Great Failures in Science?
If you want to do it, I'll pitch it. I'll pitch it with you one day. I'd love to do it.
Yeah, I think there are ways to. There could be many, many interesting shows on science that are really not done at all.
Yeah, we'd have to raise money and get a production team to do it. But I think you're right. There's so much cool stuff. I mean, there's a lot of good science out there that's done by scientists on TV. But it seems that Discovery Channel, they have all these resources, but they focus on this stuff that's not really science.
Cute animals and.
Cute animals, that's right. Would a conference on failure only be uninteresting?
No, I don't think so. We're actually talking about one. Not only would it not be uninteresting, because I think we just had a 2-hour plus discussion about it. I hope it was at least a little interesting. But I also think it's an area in which you can include not only scientists, but humanists and artists as well, because they understand the case to be made for failure as well. I think especially, for example, I've been planning on one at Columbia. We're just in the early planning stages with another member of our faculty named Chris Washburn, who's a well-known jazz musician, writing a book on jazz and all the rest of that. And, of course, for him, improvisation and jazz only succeeds because of failure. There's a woman in England, Sarah Jane Bales, I believe her name is. She's a theater director, producer, teaches in Sussex, University of Sussex, and she wrote a book called Failure in Theater, Theater of Failure, in which she talks about how crucial it is to fail in theater. So I think that's one of the interesting areas about failure is that you can actually, it's one of those places where we truly can cross disciplines a bit into the humanities and social sciences.
I think that would be valuable. If scientists talking about their failures, social scientists, historians, philosophers, that would be a nice meeting.
And about the role failure plays in all of it.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be. I'd go to that meeting.
There you go.
I think we've touched on this question, but let's do it again. Are the greatest scientists also the best at failing?
Oh, well, that's a good question. It's always hard to make a blanket statement. I suppose So it's so hard to know because the history of science doesn't really tell you much about the failures, do they? But yeah, I mean, to the little bit of history we know, I would say, well, first of all, every scientist finally is a failure. I mean, so Newton, who you could say was the greatest scientist, pretty close to, okay, but really in the end was a failure. I mean, his calculations work, his ideas are workable, but as a description of gravity, he's simply wrong. I mean, gravity is not the attraction of two massive bodies from their centers towards each other.
Right.
It's a curvature of space or something, whatever, but it's not that. Darwin was wrong about a great deal after evolution. He never could come up with a gene, never could come up with a hereditary particle.
Right.
He had all kinds of crazy ideas which were dead wrong. Watson and Crick, I think, are a great example. There's a book I love written by Jim Watson called Genes, Gamow, and Girls. He's taken a lot of shit for this book, I have to say, because, he kind of gives this unvarnished view of science.
Yeah.
But one of the really interesting historians of science, by the way, love the book because they think it's an unvarnished view of science and how it went on. But there are two things I love about the book. One is that all they do is talk about science, even though they go to parties and girls and all the rest of that. They just talk about science almost everywhere. And the other is this bald admission that for the 10 years after 1953, the discovery of the structure of DNA, they had nothing but a string of failures. For 10 years, they got nowhere, virtually nowhere, going to the next step. Till Crick finally broke through with the codon theory and all the rest of that. But for 10 years, they were bankrupt. Nothing good happened. So, I think every great scientist at some point, at some level, is finally a failure.
All right. So your next one-word book, I have a suggestion. It should be Curiosity.
So Curiosity is
because that's a big part of science, right?
It's a tremendous part of science. And one of the scientists who I had come, one of our faculty members, a woman named Jackie Gottlieb, came to do ignorance one time, and she studied sort of higher mental processes. So I asked her about curiosity, and she said, here's a curious thing about curiosity. You think we would all want to know about it, but if you look through the literature, you'll find fewer than 5 papers that actually attempt to understand curiosity.
Wow.
So I would like to write a book about curiosity, but I don't think there's enough to write about curiously, if you will. It's really an under-investigated area that we don't understand.
Yeah, we talk a lot about it. I think there's an Einstein quote, which I might have found in here. He said, "I'm nothing special. I'm just passionately curious."
It's not in there, but I do know that quote, yes.
And that totally resonates with me because I just feel that I'm curious about things.
Yeah, aren't we the luckiest people in the world to have a job where curiosity is like that's what you're supposed to do every day?
And people always... I hear people saying they're bored, and I say, "How can you be bored if you're just curious? You'll never be bored."
There's so much not known.
If you're sitting on a train, look out the window and ask yourself, "What is that, and how does that work?"
Yeah,
you'll never be bored, right? So
I think,
I think you could, and it might be interesting to talk to different scientists and get their ideas on what curiosity has played, and maybe some examples. And you could. It might be even shorter than failure, but
yes.
It would be it doesn't fit in your series because it's more positive.
Yeah, that's the trouble. It's also
but anyway.
Well, this curiosity killed the cat. I guess we could
right.
put that spin on it too.
This episode of TWiV is also sponsored by the American Society for Virology. They want you to know about their annual meeting coming up on June 18th through the 22nd at Virginia Tech University, being organized by XJ Mang and Zach Edelman. Keynote address will be given by Dr. Stephen Russell on oncolytic viral therapy, followed by 5 days of symposia, workshops, poster sessions, and state-of-the-art lectures. You can come listen to Joe Handelsman talk about leading the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, be part of a live TWiV audience, and enhance your presentation skills at the Career Development Workshop. Also, this year, ASV is hosting a special Zika virus oral workshop and poster session, and they've issued a call for late-breaking abstracts with a deadline of May 16th. Early registration with reduced rates ends May 20th. Go to asv2016.cpe.vt.edu or asv.org for more information. Hope to see you all there. Well, this episode of TWiV will be at iTunes and also microbe.tv/TWiV. And if you have any questions or comments, send them to twiv@microbe.tv, and make sure you pick up a copy of Failure to go along with your ignorance. My guest today has been Stuart Firestein from Columbia University. Thanks so much, Stuart.
Thank you, Vincent. Always a pleasure.
I know I've kept you here a long time.
No, I've enjoyed every minute.
I love chatting with you always. And, our chat at the Strand should be out on video one of these weeks. That'll be fun. That was a lot of fun, right?
It was a lot of fun, although video always worries me. The radio, as they say, the New Yorker cartoon with the two dogs online, nobody knows you're a dog on the internet.
That's right. So that's absolutely right. Anyway, thanks so much.
It all hangs out in the video.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.ws. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.